From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien discusses the notable improvement in grain sorghum prices at Kansas delivery points of late, among his topics during his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also, from the Kansas Farm Management Association here at K-State, Kevin Herbel and Mark Dikeman will offer up several things for you producers to think about here at year's end regarding overall farm management planning and tax management. One objective there being to take steps to avoid reporting a net operating loss for 2017. And later, with her weekly update on the Kansas agricultural weather scene, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more straight ahead on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
A glance now to the grain market trends and the comments this week from Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan along with us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And Dan, if there is a shining light in these markets, at least this week, it might well be what's going on with local grain sorghum prices at our Kansas elevators. The basis is strengthening, and you've been tracking this quite closely, you say.
Cash prices for grain sorghum competitive with, in a number of instances, higher than corn. When you look at the reports on Wednesday, December the 6th, see the basis in Salina at 55 under the March contract, and then you compare that to the grain sorghum basis at 20 to 25 under. So, again, about at least a 30-35 cent advantage for grain sorghum at this time. Wellington, down south central Kansas, corn at 45 under the March contract, grain sorghum at 25 under. Hutchinson, pretty similar, about 25 under for the top bid for Hutchinson, and that's almost, well, that'd be for corn, and then grain sorghum being just about 22 under, so about the same. Heading out to the western part of the state, for the most part, you still see near the feedlots, some of the ethanol plants out in that area, you do see is a little bit wider out there. Still say at Garden City, 50 under for grain sorghum, as opposed to 23 for corn. So just a matter of where the demand centers for the different feed grains are. The average basis for grain sorghum, the current basis bid compared to the average of the last 3 years, shows that the current basis bid is probably 10-15 cents narrower or stronger than it has been over time. And even at the ethanol plants, you do see, looking at corn versus grain sorghum prices on Wednesday, December the 6th, you see the top grain sorghum bid in the state at $3.48 3/4. So again, pretty strong relative to some of the weaker prices we've seen in the last several weeks as we've gone through harvest. And a basis bid of 5 under. You do still see corn basis bids at the top basis bids at Kansas ethanol plants at 30 over the March, 3.83 3/4 in comparison to that grain sorghum bid. The reason has all to do, I think, with grain sorghum export strength. You look at the latest USDA reports on where grain sorghum exports out of the U.S. are heading. They're heading to China primarily, and some to Japan. 1.153 million metric tons of grain sorghum exports accumulated this year to date, in this marketing year again, starting September the 1st. That compares to about 894,000 metric tons a year ago. So we're up, arguably 20-30%. Japan is also up pretty strong, about 65,000 metric tons, 66 this year so far in this marketing year. And that compares to about 23-24. The country that's down would be Mexico, whereas they, at this point a year ago they were at about 58,000 metric tons of imports of grain sorghum from the U.S. Now they're down to about 19. Probably looking at South American sources for feed grains, and again, all of our trade talks with them are maybe affecting some of those flows. Conversely, I think, Eric, when you stand back and look where we're seeing strength now in our grain markets as opposed to weakness, We have pretty strong grain sorghum exports, pretty strong soybean exports, and prices for both of those are pretty decent. Mm-hmm. Where we're lagging is on the corn and the overall U.S. wheat and in hard red winter wheat. And, where we're not having that daily, weekly demand pull on prices, an urgency to secure supplies that we see from this from ongoing export strength. That's where we're struggling, frankly, in a number of our commodity markets.
Although it is well worth mentioning here, as we talk local basis bids, that wheat basis, although not as robustly as grain sorghum, is nonetheless strengthening at a modest pace.
Well, yes, and it's almost surprising to see what's happened in some of these areas, particularly in south central Kansas as you look at wheat basis. We monitor some locations well across the state, but in Salina in particular, we were at about $1 under probably about a month and a half ago in terms of our wheat basis bids, and now we've strengthened to about 40 under, 50 and 40. So there's something afoot there, and so yet when you see situations, as we've seen in the past, where the basis is strengthening, but yet we don't see a lot of export business yet, you wonder if the export business is just around the corner. So we'll see what happens. Even in the southwest part of Kansas, in the Garden City area, we've seen wheat basis trend higher from where it had been about 6 to 7 weeks ago. Again, it also was from weeks about 33 to about 38 or so. We were sitting right on $1 under. Since then, we've improved about 70 or 80 under in kind of a tortured upward trend, a narrowing trend. So that's kind of quiet, good news, indicating that there's some business, some demand pull coming or just around the corner, I guess, for wheat. And that would be welcome given the way we've been struggling in terms of the wheat market and wheat market exports here in the U.S.
As you say, though, soybeans remain the stalwart of the grain markets. That's not likely to change anytime soon. And with those firm exports at the very minimum, why soybean returns will have the advantage, it would seem.
The one futures complex amongst the major ones that we watch, again, hard red winter wheat, futures on the CME, corn futures, soybeans, of those three, the only one of those that's showing us any type of a stronger upward trend would be in the soybean side. And, we had been down to about 966, 967 towards the beginning part of November, have now jumped above $10 for the January contract. So some strengthening. We hear rumors of production problems coming out of South America. Earlier on, it was more Brazil. Here in the last week or so, Argentina. Just interesting to see. Weekly export shipments, about 74 million bushels, the week ending November the 30th. We need a pace of about 36 to meet the USDA's projections, so that's not what I'd call a gangbusters pace. When we've been really strong for exports of soybeans in the past, we've been 90, 100 million bushels a week or more. So 74 is decent, a pace that's online to meet the USDA's projection. But I think overall we're competing with the large South American crop from last year that still is a factor in the market and is, I guess, a slowing or inhibiting issue with our exports. In fact, the export business sector that I guess I'm watching to see when it will pick up will be on the corn side. Again, we had exports of about 23 million bushels for the week ending November the 30th, need about 41 to meet the USDA's projections, but yet the USDA's numbers haven't backed off. The sales plus shipments number is still at about 46, 47% of the USDA's projection, and we're only a quarter of the way through the market year. So still expectations that corn exports will pick up, but until that happens, you wonder when and to what degree we'll see improvement in cash prices. I would say that here in parts of Kansas, parts of Nebraska, we have seen in some locations some business pick up, or, at least basis narrowing some. Mm-hmm. And again, if you see basis starting to narrow, but are wondering where the business is at, well, I wouldn't be surprised that the business may be coming. We'll see what happens. And all those folks, all the grain producers that have grain in storage now waiting for something to occur to give them better prices, they would be anxiously awaiting some type of strength on the export side to match what we think we're seeing for ethanol usage for feed grains and some of these other demand factors that we are hoping and looking forward to giving us some strength as we move through December out into January, February, and March.
And briefly, Dan, we should acknowledge what's on the minds of most producers right now, at least in the Central Plains, this ongoing dryness now ginning up a weather market here in early winter is a rarity, and it's not taking shape at all. But it's going to check in here at some point or the other with talk of La Nina out there and such.
La Nina is affecting growing conditions around the globe. Australia, of course, is very concerned about what they see could be coming on. If we had the weather maps that we see now during the growing season, we would be greatly concerned. But since it's over the winter time frame, we're just, again, we don't have corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum in the ground. We do have wheat, but again, its toughness and longevity is so well known that, again, a lot of people aren't concerned about it yet. They would become so in February, March, once we break dormancy. But if we have the weather conditions that we've had over the last 30 days during the growing season, we probably have a pretty strong market rally. But it's the winter. So I guess the market has the view that there's plenty of time yet for moisture to come, not to be worried about it. But again, the last 30 days, we've had just some very, very dry conditions here in the U.S., and that, of course, will have to turn around. That by the time we get off into March, April, May, we'd be looking at a pretty dire situation.
Well, Dan, we appreciate you offering up these thoughts on the trades once again, what's driving them, and we'll touch base next Friday once more. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He's with us weekly to get into the grain market factors. That is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll return after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. As we near the end of this calendar year, a number of important farm management items tend to build up that need addressing by producers, and that would include end-of-year tax management. We've invited over from the Kansas Farm Management Association here at K-State its Executive Director, Kevin Herbel, and Associate Director, Mark Dikeman. Kevin, going to ask you a very generic question, but it's always an important one. As we head into a new year, what do you consider, given the current economy in agricultural country, the important factors in the financial environment that producers are facing?
Certainly, Eric. And as we start to look at that, maybe just from a broad perspective, what each producer needs to look to do is identify their greatest risks and what can be done to reduce or manage those risks. They've likely heard whether it be an economist on the radio, whether it be their lender, speak a lot about the importance of working capital, having a strong position for their liquidity position, looking at their current assets, current liabilities. Having a strong working capital will give them a lot of flexibility as a producer. Having a weak working capital removes that flexibility. Strong working capital puts a producer in charge of the timing of what they do, rather than having circumstances or needs be what dictates that. And along with this and understanding their financial position would be having appropriate debt structure and addressing any changes that are needed there. What is their equity position, and how does that allow them to make decisions and complete the activities they do as they look to manage their farm operation, both finishing up this year as well as looking forward to next year.
And aligned with that, and you've shared this in the past as well, having a full understanding of one's cash flow and what sort of liquidity, if you will, they will need in the months ahead.
Yes, Eric. Whether or not something they do on the farm is profitable is certainly important and necessary. But making sure the cash flow works, the timing of those cash flow needs can be met is very important. Looking at input purchases, need for debt payments. need for expenses that are covered both on the business as well as in their personal expenses, things that are periodic in nature, that aren't occurring regularly throughout the year, having a plan in place to meet those needs. And certainly one way that can be very effective for them to have a better understanding of that is to complete a projected cash flow for the coming year. So knowing their financial position from a standpoint of the balance sheet and where they're at, but also taking the time to sit down and look at what they're expecting to do, what their plans are for next year, and identifying those cash flow needs and the timing of them so that they can be in a better position when those needs come along.
What about thinking ahead to capital investments, machinery, facility improvements, and so forth? This would be a great time to start getting those well in mind, would it not?
That would be true. And looking at the time we're at now in our current financial environment in agriculture, a lot less machinery and equipment upgrades and purchases have been taking place. There's been a reduction from many operations related to that. And I think in the midst of a tighter cash flow situation, the importance of planning toward machinery and equipment purchases, facility updates, all those kind of things, having a organized plan in place, identifying what are the greatest needs, not just thinking them in your head, which we all do that regularly, but actually writing them down, listing out what are the capital improvement, the machinery update, the purchase needs that we might have. Knowing and understanding as they make that list, they likely can't accomplish that list in a tight cash flow year. But as they make that list, then having the ability to prioritize and identify in what order will I want to meet these needs, and what are the ones that maybe they had a year where they did have some better yields. Some instances where livestock production and such was helpful. But if they are in a position where they're able to make some machinery, equipment upgrades, purchases, to prioritize those and make sure they're using those dollars in the most efficient, most effective manner.
And we will bring Mark in to expand on this, but end-of-year tax planning, that has to be front and center as well.
Well, as we come to the end of the year, it tends to be something that everyone thinks about a little more. We have a year where for many it's been a lower income year, and oftentimes people will kind of turn the other way and say, well, tax planning is not so important because my income's down. But we really want to remind them of the importance of tax planning even in a low-income year, making sure they're assessing things properly as they look at what's ahead of them.
In an article you recently put together on this, Mark, you noted that farm tax planning is pivotal in good years, but also in not-so-good years.
That's correct, Eric. In lower income years, oftentimes, as Kevin mentioned, we don't put as much emphasis on year-end tax planning, but there are some things that can be left on the table that we want to try to avoid. In particular, net operating losses. If someone is facing a net operating loss for the year, and we know that ahead of time, there are often things we can do to avoid that. When a net operating loss is created, things like personal exemptions and in some cases standard deduction are not. You can't utilize those. So those are things that are left on the table. If we can, at all possible, bring in more income or adjust our normal year-end spending to increase income, we can avoid some of those situations.
So there is still time to make said adjustments.
There's still time to make adjustments, and there's farmers have plenty of options in what they can do to adjust. Obviously, the selling more inventory, if available, is always an option. Delaying prepays of next year's crop inputs, potentially an option, depending on when discounts from vendors are available. But we also should look at some off-farm sources of income to try to potentially eliminate that net operating loss.
And those would include
things like a rollover of an IRA, from a traditional IRA to a Roth, which is a taxable event. Might be possible if we're looking at a negative income overall. We can plan for something like that and get that conversion made with little to no tax consequences. Other capital assets that might be held, non-farm capital assets like stocks or mutual funds or something like that, selling those and with limited tax consequences may offset some of that net operating loss and be beneficial in the long run.
Mm-hmm. How about selling commodities still in storage on hand? Grain, of course, comes to mind immediately. That's often used as an end-of-year tax management strategy. Given the intent here of avoiding a net operating loss, would you adjust that plan as a producer in any way?
That's a really valuable tool that producers have in the flexibility of that sale. Mm-hmm. And if someone's able to meet with their tax planner and do some tax planning before the end of the year, that might give them a good idea of how much to sell and what to target. If they don't have that opportunity to meet ahead of time and plan ahead of time, using deferred grain contracts is a way to create some flexibility after the fact. Mm-hmm. So if grain is sold in 2017, using a deferred payment contract, payments received in 2018, the farm business owner has an option to determine when that income is taxed. They can elect out of installment treatment of that deferred grain contract and actually tax the proceeds of that grain sale in 2017 rather than when the cash was actually received in 2018. So that after the fact planning gives us a little bit of flexibility if someone doesn't have the opportunity to meet with their tax planner or tax preparer ahead of time.
So keep that in mind. One other thing that you propose, again, in this article, and it's worth considering here, producers and others, for that matter, do have options as far as filing those tax returns, and those can be managed to one's advantage, you say.
That's correct. So a normal non-farm either business owner or tax payer is required to pay tax as they go throughout the year, either through withholding from a W-2 or from quarterly estimated tax payments. And of course, farmers can make those quarterly estimates as they go and pay ahead, and that allows them to wait until April 15th to file the return. And like everybody, if you owe tax, you're going to wait till the last possible minute to pay and file. One popular option with farmers is to forego those quarterly estimated tax payments and file their return by March 1st. But we run into some issues with that. In particular, brokerage firms that send out a consolidated 1099 often don't get those out until the middle of February. By that time that gets in the hands of the taxpayer and then to the tax preparer, we're pushing up against that right. March 1st deadline. So one option that seems to be more popular now is one estimated tax payment paid January 15th. And that would allow those farm business owners, those taxpayers, to wait until April 15th to file their return. And a final option is just ignoring the requirement to make those estimated tax payments completely and accepting that there's going to be a little bit of penalty at the end when it comes down to it. Sometimes, depending on the situation, the penalties and interest that they get tacked on are lower than what it might cost you to borrow the money if you have to use the operating line of credit for the proceeds. So it might make sense to just accept those penalties and pay the penalties and interest.
Lots of possibilities, a number of details. Of course, you flesh all of this out with your tax advisor. Good dialogue here, gentlemen, on these important matters for producers to keep well in mind as we roll into a new year and contemplate how to navigate this agricultural economy, which is posing more than its share of challenges currently. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Over from the Kansas Farm Management Association, the Executive Director and the Associate Director of the KFMA, Kevin Herbel and Mark Dikeman, respectively. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and glad to have you back. Eric Atkinson here. On to today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, on the same day that EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt met with President Trump and members of Congress from oil-producing states regarding the future of the renewable fuel standard, Pruitt was also pressed during a congressional hearing to commit to limiting corn ethanol volumes. He's faced pressure from both oil and ethanol interests in recent months to make a variety of changes to the RFS. Pruitt testified before the Environmental Subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee yesterday. This was the first time he's appeared before Congress since his confirmation earlier in the year. Representative Gene Green of Texas asked Pruitt to commit to making changes to the corn ethanol portion of the RFS by limiting the amount of ethanol in the fuel supply at just shy of 10% by volume. That's the same request made by oil industry interests. Pruitt responded saying he could not commit to anything of that sort. Pruitt also touted the agency's efforts so far to get implementation of the RFS back on track, as he put it. During the past 8 years, the agency repeatedly missed deadlines for setting RFS volumes. So far, Pruitt's EPA has announced those volumes on time. And Pruitt said the previous administration's EPA went beyond its charge and that the new agency is moving now to restore power to the states and follow the rule of law, as he said, noting in his words an important aspect of becoming a better partner with the states is recognizing that a one-size-fits-all strategy to achieve environmental outcomes has not and will not work, in his words. On the ongoing rewrite of the Waters of the United States rule, Pruitt said he has so far held primarily private meetings with industry, government, and other officials in more than 27 states. Also this past year, Pruitt said the agency is on a course to end the so-called sue and settle tactics. Over the years, he said, outside the regulatory process, well-funded special interest groups have attempted to use lawsuits to force federal agencies, especially the EPA, to issue regulations that advance their priorities, he said in his testimony. And he went on to say at some point this exercise of sue and settle and the practice of acquiescence through consent decrees or settlement agreements became all too common. He said this will not continue at the EPA. As a matter of fact, on October the 16th, Pruitt issued a memorandum to EPA employees to end the practice. In addition, the agency no longer will pay attorneys' fees to groups with which the EPA settles. The Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Kui Tiankai, this week warned about the cost of any trade war. He said that some people in Washington believe that the economic and trade issues between China and the U.S. should be resolved through a trade war. He wants to tell them that the economic and trade relations between the two countries are mutually beneficial in nature. Kui noted that a trade war with the U.S. will do immediate and long-term damage to both economies, as he said. Meantime, Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Zheng Zheguang is in Washington for talks with the Trump administration. And plant-based burger maker Beyond Meat says it has raised $55 million in funding as it seeks to triple the size of its production capacity. That funding was led by venture capital firm Cleveland Avenue LLC, which was founded by Don Thompson, the former CEO of McDonald's. Also participating in the funding is Tyson Foods, which is increasing its stake. Tyson, of course, the largest U.S. meat company by sales, previously took a 5% stake in October of last year. Beyond Meat has previously raised more than $90 million in venture capital from investors, including Bill Gates and the co-founders of Twitter. Well, as the calendar year closes out, many folks see an advantage in making donations to nonprofit entities. One option that appeals to those interested in wheat production is a contribution to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation. Jordan Hildebrand talks about all the possibilities associated with that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Jordan?
As you are making your end-of-the-year tax plans, we ask you to consider making a tax-deductible donation of cash to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation to further wheat research efforts at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. Or, better yet, how about donating an acre of wheat or a truckload of wheat to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation? All donations are used to further the mission of Kansas State University's wheat breeding program, ensuring that Kansas farmers have access to the best possible wheat varieties and that scientists can leverage human, financial, and laboratory resources to make significant improvements in wheat genetics. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation differs from the wheat checkoff. The checkoff does fund wheat research, but it is also used for marketing, promotion, and education. Donations to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation will be used only for wheat research and only at Kansas State University. The end of the year is a great time to donate wheat to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation. For many cash-basis farmers, significant tax savings can be achieved by donating crops grown directly to a charitable organization. Cash charitable contributions are deductible only as an itemized deduction from adjusted gross income, which results in reducing federal income tax only. By contributing crops to a charitable organization, a farmer can avoid including the sale of the cash crop in income and can still deduct the cost of growing the crop, which results in saving self-employment tax, federal income tax, and state income tax. A farmer can give a grain donation by giving up ownership of the grain. A gift should be made from unsold crop inventory, with no prior sale commitment made prior to the gift. A farmer will gift the grain to the charitable organization and let them decide what to do with it and when to sell it. A letter to the charitable organization summarizing the source of the gift from the farmer and an acknowledgement of the gift by the charitable organization should be kept on file. This may be needed to serve as a substitute for sales receipt in the yield verification process at FSA offices and crop insurance offices on the quantity of gifted grain, since the grain sales documents would not be in the name of the farmer, but rather in the name of the charitable organization. Depending upon the size of your gift, a number of donor recognition opportunities exist. All will be displayed in the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center so that you, your children, and your grandchildren will see that your gift played a major role in shaping the bright future of Kansas wheat production. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation was established in 2011 as the official research fundraising organization for the Kansas Wheat Commission. It is a separate, independent entity chartered by the state of Kansas as a 501c3 nonprofit research corporation. Gifts made to the Research Foundation are used solely for the purpose of funding wheat research. Gifts to the foundation are tax-deductible to the full extent of the law. A volunteer board governs the foundation. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Jordan Hildebrand.
Thanks, Jordan, and we'll be back here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Rounding out this Agriculture Today, the latest on Kansas agricultural weather. Across the way once more is K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp as we come off yet another dry week around Kansas. The droughty conditions are definitely intensifying in the state, Mary.
Yes, they certainly are. And while it was very dry, there was some moisture, believe it or not, in parts of the state. The southeast had the largest share of that moisture. They averaged 21/100ths of an inch, which sounds really good, except that's not even half of what they normally should have for a week, even in December. The south central was the next on the tier, and they averaged 7/100ths of an inch, which was about a fourth of what they should see for the week. The only other division that even averaged any measurable precipitation was the East Central, and that was a measly 100th of an inch, which is 2% of what they should get at this time of the year. So not surprisingly, we would put this in the dry column for the week, and that puts us statewide at 4/100ths of an inch, which is about 8% of our normal.
And this is all indicated in the latest drought monitor. There are places in Kansas which have moved up from abnormally dry to moderate drought. Is that correct?
Right. We had a fairly large expansion of the moderate drought, and that was mainly in the south central and central part of the state. And these are areas that were not really doing so well through the summer. They were always in at least abnormally dry conditions, and it's just really expanded again. We got a brief respite in September, but not enough to sustain that. And of course, a month of dry weather will allow things to deteriorate fairly quickly. We also saw a very large expansion of the abnormally dry conditions, and that crept up even into southeast Kansas, which had some moisture, but again, like I said, it wasn't even half of what they would typically see for that week period, so not surprising that there was some expansion in that. Now, the expansion is going to be rather slower than might be occurring during the summertime, simply because at this time of the year we don't typically get a lot of moisture. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of vegetation that's adversely affected, so the biggest danger will be for those fall-seeded crops like the winter wheat or the canola, and we'll have to see how that plays out. In fact, Romulo Lovato will have an update on the wheat conditions in today's e-update, which will be issued later this morning.
So, folks, you can look for that at the agronomy website here later on today. The real danger, though, and it is truly so, Mary, the prospect for wildfire in Kansas has accelerated greatly with these moisture conditions deteriorating consistently. Folks absolutely need to be heads up.
Right. They need to be very, very cautious. Things that this time of the year you're not usually doing the pasture burns that we expect in the springtime, but there are a lot of people that are cleaning up brush piles. They may be clearing out ditches, things of that nature. Check and see what the weather conditions are expected to be, not only the day that you light the match, but for a couple of days down the road. For example, out in western Kansas, they're expecting winds up to as much as 50 miles an hour, humidities in the single digits, and temperatures in the 50s, and those are very prone to explosive fire behavior. We're setting up for a repeat of the 2016-2017 spring season, where we had the previous summer very favorable conditions for a lot of growth in the fine fields, which are the grasses, the weeds, and some of the shrubs, and then a normally dry to abnormally dry winter, which cures those fields to tinder level. And so again, right now it's a typical fire danger, but by February, March, they've got extreme fire danger throughout the southwest and south central part of the state. So again, we want to be very, very cautious. This might be a chance to clear some of the brush away from your buildings and your sheds. Make sure that there's not as much fuel on the ground to affect your buildings.
To the outlook then, and no breakup in this pattern, it doesn't seem. We're stuck in this dry spell for a while yet.
It looks like at least for the next 8 to 14 days, which carries us out to the 21st of December. Below normal precipitation statewide carries up into Nebraska and goes down all the way to the Texas region. And when we don't normally see a lot of moisture, getting below normal moisture means there's going to be very little that will be squeezed out of any of these systems. That's not to say that we won't have frontal passages going through. They are expecting a couple of short waves to come out, but that's going to be mainly characterized by a shift in winds and a drop in temperature. So you will see a slightly shallower roller coaster. We're looking at highs in the 50s and lows in the 20s rather than highs in the 70s and lows in the teens.
And it appears we're entrenched in a La Nina pattern now, which would suggest we won't see sufficient moisture for a time.
Right. When we have a La Nina pattern, typically what that does is it produces a more zonal flow across the U.S., and that keeps most of the moisture pinned to our north. So the Dakotas have had a number of winter storm systems going through, and typically it is drier to our south, which is, again, very much what we've seen.
And temperatures ahead this next week to return to more seasonal daytime highs?
Yeah, it's going to be fairly close to seasonal, but maybe a little bit warmer because, again, highs in the 50s will be a couple of degrees above what we would typically see. Usually they're more in the mid-40s for our highs, and our lows are usually in the mid-20s. So low temperatures will be pretty seasonal. Highs may be a bit on the warm side, but not dramatically warmer than we would expect for this time of the year. Not much chance of moisture. The quantitative precip forecast for the week ending next Friday is nothing. Basically, the only chance of precip that they're showing on that map is a few pockets of snow in the mountains in Colorado, and then you have to go east of the Appalachians to see much chance in that. Nothing west of the Mississippi as far as moisture goes, and there's not even really any systems expected on shore on the west coast either, so not much to bring any chance for moisture. Again, if we get a very dramatic cool down, we could squeeze a few flakes or a few drops out of that, but that's not going to amount to much in the way of measurable precipitation.
Well, we'll grind our way through this stretch, and when we have you back next Friday, we'll offer up a holiday travel forecast for folks. Until then, many thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp with us, research and extension climatologist here at the university. Our time's away for today and for the week. Our thanks to you for tuning in, and enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.